At this point in the design, I'm ready to start actually laying my stitches together, but I realized I forgot something really important in my template. I wanted to put in some center marks so that I knew right where to align my two templates so that they more or less hit each other right smack dab in the middle. That's okay though, because I know that I've got roughly 3-inch diameter circles here and a 9-inch long design. I should be able to line these up with my cutting board and really quickly and easily find my center lines. Now I can translate some of these marks over to my templates. So now I know that on my sphere, the sort of spherical end of one template aligns with the sort of waist of another. Now this is why I chose the sphere in the first place, is because I knew that it would be a pretty decent challenge. The straight line stitches of a sort of what I might call a pillow stitch, where I would just take 2 flat pieces of fabric, lay them on top of each other, stitch around the edges, and fill the inside. Now that would create sort of a puffed 3-dimensional form, but it still kind of begins with a very 2-dimensional feeling template to it. It still kind of comes to a flat edge. Now the sphere, using the sort of baseball stitch like this, there is no flat edge on it, and sewing it together is a bit of a trick. And so what I'm going to end up having to do is consistently sort of rehold and reframe my fingers. But the beginning stitches are really important to kind of line those up. And I'll be stitching, instead of an exposed seam like my first sphere here, I'll stitch all of my seams exposed, and then right before our very end I'm going to invert the whole thing so that all my seams are on the inside of the ball. I'm going to go for a similar stitch pattern, roughly 1 centimeter or a 1/2 centimeter stitch spacing, 1/2 centimeter stitch. It's big enough that you'll be able to see it in the video, big enough that that'll take me maybe half an hour to 45 minutes or so to complete the whole thing, but probably not small enough to be able to contain something like these beans. If I was going to do a weighted toy, something that you'd be able to play with, I'd have to have a much closer stitch pattern, more like maybe the stitch pattern that you're comfortable seeing or familiar seeing with your clothes. We're talking about, you know, tiny little spacings in there. So let's go ahead and get some thread queued up on your needle, and we'll begin stitching the sphere. I'm going to start with a nice long bit of thread because I don't want to have to change it out very often. If you kind of having a hard time keeping track of all of your thread as you go, it's just fine to kind of go with short threads, and you know, a short piece of thread will get you so far. You start with another knot and keep going, start with another one and keep going. You'll notice occasionally, right, that you'll have knots all along the way of your design. The longer thread that you start with, the fewer knots that you'll have on the outside. So I want to make sure I start this off correctly, and as long as I start with the correct alignment, I shouldn't have a wrinkled or out of alignment sphere when I'm all finished. Now in order to start these stitches and sort of space them out correctly, I don't want to put my stitches too close to the edge of the fabric. If you remember in my volume 1 of this video series, I talked about the sort of fray or the edge of a torn piece of fabric. If I put my stitches too close to the edge of the fabric, they'll actually pull right out of the fabric. I need at least 1 or 2 layers of sort of warp and weft threads to hold the stitches in place. So I'm going to make my stitches about 1 centimeter back from the edge. And you know what? You could even go 2 centimeters. It just all depends on the thickness of the seam that you want. If you're consistent as you go all the way around your sphere will shrink down from its template, and all of that extra fabric will be trapped into the seams here. No harm done. As I travel along the outside of my three-dimensional object here, I need to consistently reset the seam and make sure that my stitches are always kind of coming down 1 centimeter from an evenly lined up seam edge. Because my templates were accurate and I cut them out right along the edges, all I have to do is keep resetting that seam edge so that the two pieces of fabric line up next to each other. If as you're trying to tighten up your seam, you pull too hard and it shrinks up like an accordion, go ahead and just kind of flatten that all back out. Seams are dynamic until you tie the knot in them on either end. So go ahead and just sort of keep your seam lines fairly relaxed. Make sure you're not kind of stretching them really tightly up like an accordion. It's sort of a delicate work to make your seams just tight enough, but not too tight that they shrink up like that along the edges. I'm about halfway through this stitching now, and you really can kind of start to see how the three-dimensional form is coming together. I still have this whole second flap to lay in, but I'm stopping now because I want to demonstrate how, let's just say, if as you're kind of stitching through your running stitch here, you're running out of thread, and you need to get more thread. How do you do it? Well, what you need to do is terminate this stitch, and we'll terminate it with a knot, and get some fresh thread, and just begin again. Okay, so I'm going to stop at this really critical moment now. I've got about an inch or so left to sew, maybe 2 inches left to sew, so my form has a mouth there. Now, earlier, when I did my practice piece, I left all of my seams exposed, and I stuffed the stuffing in there and just kind of finished stitching it up. Now, with this seam, I think what I would like to try to do is invert it, right, so that all of the seams are on the inside, similar to how sort of a piece of clothing, right, you never have your seams exposed, that all sort of on the inside of a piece of clothing. Now, what you can do is carefully turn your form inside out before we add any of the stuffing to it, if you want your seams to hide. It should be fairly straightforward, just like it was a pillowcase or something. Invert the whole thing, and now all of those kind of flapping seams are hidden on the inside of the piece, and we won't see them. It's a bit more challenging to sort of close up your seam, but I'll kind of give you an example of how that can happen. Now, the stuffing that we've got looks probably like quite a bit of stuffing, right? But in fact, this stuff compresses quite a bit, and the way to kind of get the most out of it is not to just wad it all up and stick it in one piece, but to probably kind of stick it in sections or stick it in tufts. And what you'll need is some sort of a probe. I just use like the back of a pencil or something like that to kind of tuck in the pieces, particularly the case if you're kind of getting it into a point or something like that. This sphere shouldn't be too difficult to stuff, but what I want to do is I want to make sure that all of the fluff I'm jamming in is really foofy. If I kind of foof it up before pushing it in, it saves me a whole lot of time and energy. Afterwards, we'll kind of have to like rough up the piece just to kind of fluff it all and fill in any voids. But if you have a dead spot and then sew it closed, it's really hard to get that dead spot filled in. Right now, what I'll try to do is sort of solve any of that problem beforehand. Okay, so I'm just about ready to close up this final seam here, and you see how the edges are all flayed up where all the rest of my seams have been sort of folded under. Now, there's a couple of ways that I could do this. I could carefully attempt to fold over this seam and just sort of put a little running stitch in the side there. I could just close it and leave an exposed seam. I'm going to do my best to sort of fold over the tips of fabric and push it through. It's going to take me a little bit more time, and it's a little bit fussier to get it through there, but before I close up anything else, on the outside here, I'm just going to make sure that I've got enough fluff inside of there and that I've got no dead spots. I have some exposed stitches, but that's okay. It's just because it wasn't so tight. Make sure that there's nothing that needs to be sort of worked from the inside with a probe, any seams that are maybe hung up, because once I stitch it closed, I really don't want to have to open it back up again. So I'll work on flattening that seam out here a little bit toward the end, but I want to sort of talk a little bit about where to hide my final knot. Now my final knot is going to end up either sitting right on the surface of this kind of messy seam here, or if I finish by only kind of piercing halfway through that seam, I can actually tuck my knot underneath on the inside. So that's not too bad. It's definitely an improvement on my first one in terms of how oblong it is. The one thing that I would like to maybe improve if I try a third one would be this finishing seam. Because I have to leave just that little bit of seam open in order to get the stuffing in, that seam is always going to look a little bit different because it won't be inverted. But the smaller I make that seam, the less obvious it is. And then maybe also choosing where to locate it on the ball. I think because I ended up putting that finishing seam right in the skinniest place of the template, it sort of wrinkled up the bottom of the ball. So I'll work that ball over in my hands a little bit, see if I can't get rid of some of those dead spots and relax the fabric. But in the next tutorial, I'll show you a little bit about how sewing machines can actually increase not just the speed, but more importantly, the precision of laying down those stitches. So if you have a machine, you might actually be able to try that out for this project as well. So for my third attempt on the sphere here, I've got another one of my templates cut out. I'm going to resolve some of the clunkiness of hand sewing by using a sewing machine. I'll demonstrate it once and then I'll kind of talk through what it is that I did. So the first thing you should probably notice almost immediately is one, it's a lot faster. I laid down about 2 or 3 inches of stitching in just a couple of seconds, right? Really, really fast. Also, I'm laying down really nice, even straight lines and very perfectly spaced stitches. Now, how does a sewing machine do that? Well, there's a couple of really important parts here I want you to pay attention to. First of all, I've got 2 threads coming through the machine, similar to how you have 2 threads with a hand sewing needle. One of those threads comes down through the actual sewing needle itself and through the top of the machine. Also, hiding underneath the table of the sewing machine is the bobbin, a second spool of thread. Those 2 spools of thread get hooked together in what's called a lock stitch, and that lock stitch results in sort of a bumpy stitch on the top and a straight line stitch on the back. And so this is the sort of stitch that you're more likely to find on your clothing, right, than any of that hand stitching. The other thing about a sewing machine that makes this really handy is a mechanical foot at the bottom here that incrementally pulls the material through at just the right spacing. Now, that's how I get a nice evenly spaced stitch all along this here. So if you noticed, early in the process, I was actually using the using this sort of knob on the back end of the machine to literally use the machine to help me hand sew. I noticed almost immediately that I'm getting a lot cleaner, more even results with the machine than I was by hand. But even the machine, right? Until I got comfortable using the foot pedal to use the mechanical motor, I wanted to kind of get the template started with the crank, and also I want to keep my fingers away from the business end of this machine. Just like any power tool, it can be very powerful and kind of a dangerous place to be putting your fingers, especially with such a tight, detailed design. I still have to go back to the studio to fill this thing, and I'll be using a hand stitch to finish up on this side. But that would be that if you have the opportunity to work with a big machine like this, that would be one really nice way to sort of clean up your stitches. So I'm back in the studio, and I've filled this piece with a combination of the leftover foam that I had, or leftover fluff that I had, and I also raided the pantry and grabbed some of these lentils to sort of give this piece a little bit more weight, and as well as the sort of soft squish of the polyfill. Now all I have to do is kind of hand sew this last little seam here on top, and I'll be all wrapped up with 3 different attempts. I'm pretty happy with the template, and I've learned a whole bunch kind of going one to the next, but I'm really excited to see how you guys fare designing your own templates and learning to hand stitch for the first time. If you can figure it out in one shot, that's awesome. But don't be afraid if you have to start it over and do 1 or 2 of these things to get it right.